Okay, welcome to the fifth session on day 2 on equity and choice. I'm going to give some brief remarks and then hand over to our first speaker. So Noreen is our first speaker, and she's going to talk about work from the Pakistan country research team. She'll tell us about the impacts of a policy that delivered cash grants to public schools operating in markets with substantial choice. And what she'll highlight is the potential for choice in that schooling market is maybe a mechanism that explains a spillover effect from public schools onto private schools. So the operation of the choice mechanism being part of the story there. Our next speaker will be Amanda, who's going to be presenting work from the Indonesia country research team. And she's going to tell us about a policy that changed admissions criterion from test scores to distance, which meant lower scoring students gained access to good schools. And she'll highlight for us how changing school composition through, again, choice had heterogeneous impacts, different impacts on lower scoring students versus other students, and talk about the overall impact. Our third speaker is Darwin, and he's going to talk about work from the Ethiopia country research team. And he's going to start with a very striking result. He's actually going to be joined by Kane, but it's Darwin who's going to start. He's going to talk about a very striking result that there was a decline in math scores at the start of grade 4 from 2011 through to 2018. There was some variation in within year test scores as well, but focusing in on that. And he's going to discuss the extent to which there might be a compositional effect, in particular an expansion enrollment that might lie behind that. So again, thinking about composition of which students are attending school and how that might impact on learning outcomes. And all of our three speakers up to that point will have emphasized how these different policies impacted on different groups, including by gender. And our final speaker, Suyun, is going to focus in on gender explicitly, and she's going to present results from an intervention that was about experiential learning in STEM subjects. And she's going to show us how that hands-on approach actually impacted gender attitudes, and then how that followed through into labour market and fertility aspirations. So all of our papers are connected around these themes of equity and choice. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Noreen, who's going to talk from the DC Hub. Over to you, Noreen.
Can you hear me? Oh, yes. There's my whole face. Okay, thanks, Claire. So this is joint work with Tahir Andrabi, Natalie Bao, Jishnu Das, who's not here, and Asim Khwaja. Oh no, that's on tape forever. And I'm going to talk about the equilibrium effects of public spending in education. There we go. So we're all here because learning is a key challenge globally, right? But education markets have really changed in low-income countries in recent decades, and now many students live in settings where there's considerable choice of schools that they can attend. So, for example, 30% of students in rural Pakistan live in villages with 7 to 8 schools that they can choose from, and 60% I got that wrong. Private schools account for 30% in enrollment. So here what we're going to do is examine how market structure can improve learning outcomes. So we'll study the effects of a government policy that provided cash grants and afforded parents greater control to public schools. And we had randomized implementation across villages as it would be implemented in practice. And a key feature of these markets is that they are closed education markets, meaning that all the schools that are in the village have students who live in that village, and all students who live in that village attend schools in that village. And we'll, of course, examine the impact on public schools, but we're also going to ask whether spending on public schools affected the private market. And we're going to do this several years after the program, which will allow us to estimate spillover effects in equilibrium across both sectors, so including the private sector. Okay, so why look at the equilibrium effects of public spending? So ex ante, we may not expect that there would be large effects, right? So while there is evidence that public spending is beneficial in the US, in low-income countries, in this case, there's low accountability. And so this has led to quite a bit of hesitance in providing funding to public schools. But that intuition ignores equilibrium effects. So improving public school quality could have impacts on the private schooling market through these equilibrium effects because private schools have high-powered incentives, right? So in contrast, public schools might not be expected to respond much to competition because they have low accountability, but it's important to also consider effects on private schools. So in this context, villages have typically 7 schools, public and private, from which they can choose. And the choice of school to attend is really sensitive in terms of the distance between a student's home and school. So pre-treatment in the private sector, private schools are co-educational. Primary enrollment is about 55 students, and they have really low costs. So it's only about half of average daily income for a household. In public schools, these are sex segregated. Primary enrollment is about double that of private schools, and there are 0 school fees. This program, so schools were supposed to be provided with a fungible infusion of cash, which amounted to about $1,300 per year, which is 15% of a school's typical operating budget, which is really large. The policy established and strengthened school councils as well. They encouraged more meetings, more parental involvement, and the creation of investment plans. So we were completely uninvolved in within village distribution of money across schools. So the government could allocate schools with a certain amount of money or even none at all. And we think about this as improving external validity, right? This is how the government would actually implement it. So we have 5 rounds of data collection. 2003 was round 1, collected a couple other rounds. Round 4, 2006, is when the money for this program really arrived. The program was expanded in between, and then we collect data several years later for round 5 in 2011. So looking at the flows of funds, corroborating the timeline there, we see that it was in round 4, 2006, where there was this major injection of funds to public schools. That's the dashed line. We see that funding continued, and that control villages actually also started receiving funding. So just taking a look at this next slide, in terms of cumulative funding, and we see here that treatment villages always had more funding than control villages. It's actually a substantial amount. The red line is median annual expenditures in public schools. So we can sort of think about this as a randomized phase-in, and we're identifying kind of off that difference. So we're using the LEAPS data from Attock and Faisalabad, 80 villages. We consider rounds 1 and 2 the pure pre-period, and that's what we use to construct control variables and check for balance. There were some small funding flows in round 3, so we don't use that data because we don't think that's either pre or post. So the major flows came in round 4, but there was really little time for public schools to spend the money, and there was also very little time for private schools to respond. So we focus on round 5 outcomes, and this allows us to evaluate the medium-term effects of the policy after the market has reached the new equilibrium. So first, we're going to look at village-level effects on test scores. So this is all sectors, both public and private, and it captures the average effect on all students in the village. And this ensures that the effects here are not driven by compositional changes. We need to do that before we think about decomposing effects by sector, right? And so what we see here is that there's a 0.2 standard deviation improvement in test scores. He's not here, but apologies to Alex for using standard deviations, but it was too late for this presentation. So next, let's decompose effects by sector. Columns 1 and 2 are public schools, 3 and 4 are private schools. And the key finding here is that there are substantial, but also similarly sized effects in public and private schools, which is pretty interesting. So what could be driving these sectoral level improvements today? Okay. So the first possibility is that there are changes in the composition of the student body, right? So to think about that, we're going to look at enrollment and school composition. Another possibility is extensive margin changes in the composition of private schools in the market. So we're going to look at private school entry and exit as outcomes. And the third possibility is sort of this residual explanation that instead there were intensive margin changes in existing schools' quality. So taking a look at enrollment, we really don't see any impacts on enrollment for schools that existed in round 5. But remember, this doesn't imply that there are no competitive incentives, right? This is an equilibrium outcome several years later. I'll just briefly note, and I won't show everything, but we did a number of checks on student composition and how they look different, possibly across public and private schools, and we didn't find any evidence of students selecting differentially into the two sectors. I know he's here. All right, so next we'll look at the private sector and whether schools exited or entered the market. In columns 1 and 2, the dependent variable is the number of private school entrants in the village, and in 3 and 4, we have an indicator variable for whether the private school exited the market between rounds 3 and 5. We see no significant effects on either of these outcomes, and so this suggests that within sector test score effects are actually driven by quality improvements. Just briefly touching on private school fees, while the coefficients are positive and we can't rule out change in fees, the coefficients are not significant.
Noreen, you have 5 minutes left.
What?
5 minutes.
Isn't this a 15 minutes presentation?
Yeah, you have 5 left.
Dang it. Okay. What? I just practiced this. Okay. So I just want to say, private schools respond to competitive incentives. So here we have a measure of horizontal competition, and we interact the treatment effect with the average distance from each private school to all the public schools in the village at baseline. And what we find is that public schools, when private schools who are closer to public schools respond much more to this treatment. They also respond more so when the average quality of public schools in the market is higher. So a 1 standard deviation better average in public school quality leads to a 0.3 in standard deviation increase in the private sector. Okay, so we're going to quantify this multiplier effect, and we're going to calculate the change in test scores per dollar in 2 ways, with and without test score effects in private schools. And what we find is that when you don't account for the positive impacts of students in private schools, you would underestimate cost effectiveness by 46%. And to conclude, so we see that public school grants led to large sustained increases in test scores in both sectors. And it's really important to take into account equilibrium effects. So we would underestimate by 46%. And this is a counterintuitive finding. So providing funding to the sector with lower powered incentives actually can leverage incentives in the high powered incentives private sector and improve quality for both sectors. Did I finish on time? I have more time?
You have 2 minutes 45 left. If you want to go back and go over something that you skipped, feel free.
Okay, so I'll just briefly touch on whether schools that received more money improved more. Okay, so whether a village was enrolled or not was random, but how much money was given to a particular school was not. But first, we need to assess the degree to which schools that received money were selected. So we run a lasso on a huge pool of controls from rounds 1 and 2, and lasso doesn't select a single one. So this suggests that within village variation is pretty small, and we can look at the relationship between money dispersed and test scores. And indeed, there is a positive relationship, and the size is about double in private schools. Okay, that's it. Hashtag fail. Oh my God. I'm gonna publicly apologize, Jishnu. That was terrible. Okay.
We're going to hand over to Amanda. Amanda, apparently there's going to be a small delay in getting your slides up. Oh, well, that was an incredibly small delay. So I think you can just start talking. They should move through. Good.
How's that go? Do you see some slides moving?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, RISE Directorate, BSG, OPM for a great conference so far. I'm really grateful to be part of it. As Claire mentioned, I'm talking about a change in admissions policy for public junior secondary schools in Indonesia. And this work is joint with 6 of my other RISE Indonesia teammates. So there's a large policy debate and accompanying body of research that attempts to answer the question, how and for whom to expand access to high-performing schools, and how these schools will respond to students with different performance levels. And predicting these outcomes is really complicated, right? Because systems are dynamic, and by dynamic, I mean that students and teachers and administrators and facilities all interact in really complex ways. And so when making really large policy changes to the composition of any of these things, it can be hard to anticipate what kind of effects the changes will have, who will benefit and lose from the policy change. The specific question that our research that I'm going to talk about today seeks to answer is, what are the learning impacts of a policy that markedly changes student composition within schools on students throughout the system? And so in this case, that means students in public schools and private schools throughout the learning distribution. So just a bit about context. Junior secondary schools in Indonesia include grades 7 to 9. Education is compulsory through grade 9. Public junior secondary schools in Indonesia usually don't have the capacity to serve all residents, especially in more densely populated areas, and they usually won't expand capacity due to pressure from private schools. In systems with multiple secondary schools, there's a choice. So students apply to schools by ranking their preferences. They can usually attend any school in the system, sometimes schools outside of the system that they're accepted to. And admissions for junior secondary schools are generally based on a test score ranking that uses the grade 6 leaving exam or the WASTA. So applicants who have higher test scores are more likely to get into the more preferred schools. Public schools are generally higher quality, have higher school value added than private schools, and qualifying students, so students who are eligible for social benefits, can use vouchers to go to private school, but they usually only choose private schools if they can't get into public schools. So just specifically on our context, so our research takes place in the city of Yogyakarta, which is a medium-sized city of about 420,000 people in central Java. And this is a very high performing district. So 13 out of the 16 public junior secondary schools in the city were in the top 100 schools across the country in 2019 in terms of their grade 9 test scores. And this is a map of the city. You can see the yellow and black dots represent public and private schools. And I'm showing you a map of where the schools are located because we discuss a policy change that grants increased access to schools based on a student's residence. So the borders in the map show administrative areas or neighborhoods called Kelurahan. And the shading in each Kelurahan represents the share of students who have a below median grade 6 math UASTA score. So this map basically shows that many public schools are located in neighborhoods with lower testing students. The light pink represents Kelurahan, where 50 to 75% of students have below median test scores. So here I'm going to talk about the policy change that we studied. This table shows the percent of seats allocated in each school according to the different admissions criteria. And so this green column here is the policy before the change. This is called pre-zoning because the policy change is called zoning, which is kind of a nod to residence-based admissions. And you can see that these three categories all use test score rankings. There's a category for Jogja residents, a category for applicants outside of the city, and also students who qualify for social benefits are also admitted using a test score ranking. So higher testing applicants among those who qualify would be admitted to schools. In 2017, the Central Ministry of Education wanted to expand access to schools for lower testing students. And so they required districts to implement these zoning policies, which more heavily favored location-based admissions. So the city of Yogyakarta really resisted these changes, but eventually announced a change in May of 2018. And that's this blue column. Something to note about the timing is by this point, students had already taken their OASTA exam, so the school year starts in July. So we don't think students could have changed their testing behavior as a result of the policy announcement. There was also very little time to allow for families to move closer to a preferred school. So, and we don't see much evidence of mobility. So looking at this blue column, you can see now basically that 75% of the seats are allocated using this proximity ranking. And here proximity to the school is determined by the distance between a central location in the student's neighborhood to school, not necessarily their house to school. And also you can see that the test score ranking here shrunk to 15% of seats. You should also note here that basically the share of seats available to students from outside of Jogja declined. So this effectively expanded seats for Yogyakarta residents. Due to parental pressure, the city changed the policy again in 2019. And so you can see here, that's this third column in orange. This wasn't a total boomerang back to the pre-zoning policy, but it was certainly in that direction. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the data that we use. I talked about the UASTA, which is the grade 6 exam, and we have those data for all students who attended public and private primary schools in Jogja from 2017 to 2019. Those tests are in math and in Indonesian. We also administered an N-line test or a student learning assessment, SLA, in math and Indonesian across 16 public and 30 private schools. We have about 4,000 students in our sample for each cohort, and we make two different comparisons. So the first is measuring the impacts of the policy change after 18 months. And then this second change is measuring the results over 6 months. So this latter comparison, it's a very short time frame, obviously, basically helps us demonstrate that the changes we see were due to the policy and not external factors. Okay, so in our analysis, we look at impacts for the full distribution of learners and also by OASTA quintile, which is obviously our baseline measure. And here in this green column, we can see that the pre-zoning enrollment levels for each OASTA, we can see pre-zoning enrollment levels for each OASTA math quintile in public school. And you can see that enrollment is lowest for the bottom quintile. About 17% of kids in that quintile were enrolled in public school. So now with the first policy change, we see that this quintile sees the largest gain in enrollment. And this tiny table at the bottom basically shows that on average, the OASTA scores in math went down in public and up in private schools. Okay, so now we move on to thinking about how to estimate the impact of this policy, right? The previous slide was the descriptives showing how the composition changed. So what's the impact on learning? So we start by asking, okay, what would we expect to happen here? What do we want to achieve? And we do that by simulating test scores for the first zoning cohort. So that's the cohort affected by the policy change, holding value added constant, meaning we ask what would learning outcomes look like if schools could maintain their pre-zoning grade 8 test scores with this new student composition. And then we use this equation here for the impact estimate. So we produce simulated and actual scores, which are this Y2, and we compare the results for the cohorts conditional on their baseline scores and student background characteristics. This allows us to benchmark our estimates to understand what we would find under maybe totally unrealistic, but also optimal conditions, and also helps us think about how we should interpret the difference between these two, how to think about learning changes for students across different school types and across the learning distribution. Okay, so these are the predicted results. Math is gray, Indonesian is red. And the first thing to note here is that the overall effect is positive and not neutral. And this is because remember that the policy increased seats for Yogyakarta residents by about 15%, and because public schools have higher school value added. So more seats in public schools should cause these positive effects. Second, you notice down here, more positive results for lower quintile kids. Yes. Yep.
5 minutes.
Thank you.
Minutes.
We notice more positive effects for the lower quintile kids, which is maybe what we'd expect because they see the biggest change in public school enrollment. This might be a bit unexpected up here, but we see this negative coefficient for the top quintile. We think that this is due to a combination of public school enrollment going down for this group. There was about a 10 percentage point change decline, and some shifting of this group into lower quality public schools. So they even moved around within the public system. Okay, so these are the actual results. So along with the predicted, which I just showed you, and the actual results are the bolder lines and these numbers on the right. You can see that the actual results are somewhat different from our predictions. Overall learning declined, so this up here, but this change is not significant. And remember, we expected an increase. The declines are somewhat higher for the higher quintiles, but the lower quintiles also saw lower learning gains than we expected. I think, I also want to emphasize here, though, just thinking about the equity question, the disparity between quintiles 1 and 5 went down. Okay. So now I'm just going to talk about what happened with the second policy change. So the figure on the left is the difference between the pre-zoning and the zoning, which I just showed you in the previous slide. And on the right side is the difference between the first and the second policy change. And you can see there's an opposite effects. So the changes from the second policy aren't as dramatic as the first, but one thing to highlight is that, we do see positive effects here for the upper quintiles. This is the 0.18 standard deviation increase in quintile 5. Again, remember, this is just 6 months after the policy change. And I think this slide also supports our claim that the effects are due to the policy and not other external factors. Okay, so what's happening? This is still a work in progress. We're still trying to figure it out. One potential pathway that we see is that there was a decline in student-reported tutoring, as shown in this bar figure. So there's about a 15 percentage point decline in tutoring across different subjects in public schools. And we know that there was no change in tutoring for kids in the highest quintile. So we think that this is affecting the lower quintile students more. This is possibly because lower testing students either can't afford tutoring in public schools, which is actually more expensive than tutoring in private schools, or because parents assume that these kids don't need tutoring now since their children go to better schools. The student reports are corroborated by teacher reports. That's the table on the bottom, where we see an overall decline in the share of teachers reporting doing any tutoring outside of their teaching hours, and also a decline in their reported minutes per week spent tutoring. One thing to note here is that teachers just don't move in this context. So the district rotates teachers around schools every few years, and they didn't rotate during our study period. Okay, just to wrap up here. So trying to answer this question about equity, I think the first thing to note here is that the standard deviation difference between quintiles 1 and 5 declined as a result of the policy. But the policy still had pretty limited effects on the bottom quintile of students.
1 minute.
Thank you. For whom access really increased dramatically. We also know that college-going aspirations declined, although this is minimal. This was for the whole sample overall. So we know this is not just because, kids with lower aspirations are now getting into public schools. Obviously, we're measuring short-term effects here. This was 18 months after a policy change. These are good schools. I think these are committed teachers. It's possible that the schools really just need time to adjust, and we might see a different impact kind of with a longer time horizon. And lastly, just thinking about the implications for policy design, I only really have a very obvious conclusion here is that, when you're making really large changes in student composition, you can't always assume that schools are going to be able to maintain previous learning levels. Like, this is a huge adjustment for a system that, has very entrenched ways of operating. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Can I invite, do you want to just come up first and then Kane, or do you want to both stand there? Okay, great.
Thank you, Claire. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here and present our work in person, at least to this audience. Yeah, I will be presenting the first part of our work, and Kane will be presenting the second half. I would like to start by giving you a little bit of background to our study. Between the year 2012 and 2018, large-scale nationwide educational reform was implemented in primary schools in Ethiopia. And this reform, which is called GQIP2, had several components, and some of the major components, or some of the key components of GQIP2 included building additional classrooms, particularly in the rural parts of Ethiopia, furnishing schools and classrooms with key resources like computers, radios, making sure that schools have access to the internet, increasing the supply of qualified primary school teachers, supporting continuous in-service training for teachers, providing students with textbooks for each subject. So these were some of the key components, and the overall goal of GQIP2 was to enhance students' learning outcomes equitably by improving teaching and learning conditions in schools. Our starting point was, although GQIP2 was implemented from 2012 to 2018, there is little systematic and comprehensive evidence that assess the impact of GQIP2 on students' learning outcomes. So as part of the RISE Ethiopia project, we've been trying to address this general goal to understand the impacts of the GQIP2 educational reform on improving students' learning outcomes. Just to give you a little bit of background on what happened between 2012 and 2018 in Ethiopia, this was a period of general economic development, and enrollment and quality improvements were priorities for policy in Ethiopia. As you can see from this graph, if you look at the year from 2012 until 2017, 2018, the net enrollment ratio increased rapidly. You can see there a steeper increase in net enrollment ratio between those years. And again, as you can see also from this graph, there was a reduction in repetition rates from grade 1 to grade 8, especially if you look at from 2012 until 2017, 18, there was a steeper decline in repetition rates. Well, some of you may say that this may not necessarily indicate an improvement if students were promoted to the next grade level automatically without making sure that they achieve the minimum learning competencies. But unfortunately, improving learning outcomes equitably remains a big challenge in Ethiopia, despite a huge investment posed by the government of Ethiopia and donor partners. We couldn't, or the country couldn't repeat the successes in enrollment and completion to raising students' learning outcomes. So it's with this background that we attempted to address these two research questions. One is, how have learning outcomes among primary school students in Ethiopia changed over the period 2012 to 2018? And the second research question was, what explains changes in learning outcomes over time? Very quickly, with regard to our data sources, so we, for the purpose of this study, we used data collected in 2012-13 as part of the Young Lives Ethiopia project. We focused on students, grade 4 students, who were attending their school in 33 schools in 6 regions in Ethiopia. And as part of the RISE Ethiopia project, we followed those 33 schools, but of course a different cohort of grade 4 students, and we administered comparable or similar instruments in 2018-19. So as you can see there, we tried to use comparable or similar instruments like student questionnaire. The numeracy test for the grade 4 students was administered both at the beginning and end of grade 4, and we had also other instruments like household questionnaire and so on. I have to confess here that our sample were not perfect representative, both nationally and regionally, but the beauty of our data is that we followed the same 33 schools from 2012 before the start of the implementation of GQIP 2 until 2018-19, right after the end of the implementation of GQIP 2. And what were our main findings? Regarding question number 1, because research question 1, we have these 2 major findings. I would like to start with the first one. As you can see from this graph, if you look at the 2012 cohort, there was a decline in numeracy achievement over time. That's the most important thing first. So if you look at the baseline score, it falls from 493 in 2012-13 to 455 in 2018-19. So there was a decline of 38 points or 0.38 standard deviation. And if we look at the end line scores at the end of grade 4 in 2012-13, it was 524 and it falls to 491, a decline of 33 points or 0.33 standard deviation. So this was a very striking finding for us. And the second important finding related to research question number 1 was there was some learning happening in both cohorts. If you look at 2012, if you look at this cohort, the 2012-13 cohort, there was a progress of 31 points within a school year, from 493 to 524. And the 2018-19 cohort, the learning progress within a school year was 36 points, slightly higher than the 2012-13 cohort. So if you look at the drop here, the 2012-2018 drop out of 0.38 standard deviation in start of school course is equivalent to 1 year of instruction in mathematics. That was the whole drop. So that means students at the start of grade 4 in 2018 were approximately 1 year of math schooling behind their predecessors in 2012. So the biggest puzzle for us is, why did learning levels at the start of grade 4 decline so steeply between 2012 and 2018? When we disaggregate the scores across rural urban locations, the pattern was the same. The decline in numeracy levels was observed both in urban and rural locations. If you look at this graph, what's interesting is rural students in 2018-19 made a higher progress within a school year than rural students in 2012-13. But the progress by urban students was the same 34 points both in 2012-13 and 2018-19. Again, when we disaggregated the results across gender, the pattern was the same, but the decline for female students both at the start and end of grade 4 was larger than for male students. So we can see that the gender gap started to somehow increase. Again, when we disaggregate the results across regions, all the students across regions experienced learning decline or decline in learning levels. But the decline in learning levels was greatest in SNNP, Oromia, and Somali regions. And learning levels in Somali region, one of the most disadvantaged regions, were the lowest. And Kane will continue with what explains changes in learning outcomes.
Thank you, Jawed. So it's rather a puzzle, and it's not something we necessarily fully anticipated, because the project is intended to assess the impact potentially of the GQuIP program rather than necessarily the changes in learning outcomes over this period of time. But nonetheless, we have this data, and this is perhaps one of the most interesting things that we have from the RISE data in Ethiopia. So potential explanations that could apply to this particular phenomenon include things like aspects of the GQuIP program specifically, such as changes in school quality, changes in teacher quality. Those are the ones that we're most interested in. But of course, there are many other intervening factors that we have more or less data about, some of which are other policies that have been going on at the same time, such as changes in preschooling, changes in the curriculum, which obviously affect the ways that our tests have worked and the way that they've picked up pupils' abilities in mathematics. Differences in sampling issues. For example, there have been new schools opening in the areas that were included in the surveys. And of course, we don't have information on every school that children went to in those districts. We only have information on the 33 schools that we are sampling. Importantly, changes in the composition of schools. So the backgrounds of children have changed, and the children in the schools that we are sampling have changed substantially. And I'll come to that in a moment. And then, of course, regional or contextual issues that Dawit has hinted at. So in terms of school quality indicators, what we found generally is that there is wholesale improvement in most of the indicators. So schools are more likely to have a library, a resource center, more likely to have working computers, radios, number of classrooms has increased, class size has gone down, schools operating a full-day shift have also increased. So mostly there is an improvement in resources, with two exceptions. One is the number of pupils per textbook and whether schools have received a school grant or not. On teachers, mostly there has been an improvement in quality too. So all of our indicators improved, with the exception of, if you like, teachers' age and experience. And we're not clear that age and experience are strong determinants of pupils' attainments. But nonetheless, the proportion of teachers who had training, the proportion who had university degrees, the proportion who were specialist teachers, all improved. On pupils' backgrounds, it's a little bit more mixed, and perhaps it's a negative picture in a sense, because the average backgrounds of pupils declined. So the assets in the pupils' households worsened on average. Pupils were on average poorer. There were more students with illiterate parents. There were more students taking a longer time to reach school by walking, and fewer students whose biological mother and father were alive. So on average, the background characteristics of students have worsened, which indicates, of course, that there's an improvement in access. So the more disadvantaged children are getting into the schools that are in our sample. So that's a good thing for access, but in a sense, it's also telling us that on average, the pupils are more disadvantaged. But on their behaviors, those things did improve. So attendance improved, hours spent doing homework improved, and also dropout reduced and absenteeism reduced. The issue of assets is complex, and it was different in different regions, but it did decline in all the regions that we were including in the sample. So all regions, pupils became poorer on average. Another issue was the test items. So we're asking the question, are these test items still valid across the whole period? Were they things that we could realistically say were measuring properly the pupils' abilities and performance in mathematics? We concluded that they were. And if you see along here, these 4 test items, you can see that every single one of them has declined. The percentage correct has declined, but they're all questions that you would like to include in any grade 4 maths test. You know, which of these is a triangle? What is half of 6? Which of the closest? Which of these is the closest to 900,000? They're fairly straightforward questions that you would expect to see anywhere. So I don't think test effects explains very much. So we've tried various methods to explain this gap in performance at the beginning of grade 4. Regression methods, for example, propensity score matching, it only explains a small proportion of it. So here we're just presenting the descriptive statistic, or at least a simple regression model, what we've done is predicted the scores using the Young Lives data that RISE children would have had with the same characteristics. And then we've subtracted their actual score so that you can see how much underperformance there is on a simple scale. So in the bottom left, you've got rural versus urban. And so urban pupils, they still did less well than expected on the basis of the Young Lives data, but not as poorly as rural students. And then by region, there were two regions, Oromia and SNNP, where pupils performed particularly badly in relation to our expectations, which come from the Young Lives model. And then by school, that third graph there is one of those bars is each a school that was included in the 33 school sample. Nearly all of them have performed less well than we expected, with the exception of 5 schools that have done slightly better. Then finally, in terms of other indicators which we think might have some role in explaining this, students who'd attended preschool didn't do any better in terms of expectations and actually did worse in the RISE sample. So the predicted value of preschool children who'd attended preschools results was lower than expected. Those who were taught by a specialist maths teacher did do better. So there were certain factors that mitigated against this decline. Specialist maths teacher seems to be one of them. And the other, most notably, is those who attended a school which had working internet. So finally, to conclude, the decline in learning levels, of course, is not necessarily an indicator of the failure of the GQuIP program. In fact, the GQuIP program was designed to improve indicators of school quality and teacher quality, and it has done that, or at least those things have improved. We can't necessarily attribute that to the program, but they have improved. But nonetheless, pupils' test scores have not improved in mathematics, and they have got worse quite substantially. Finally, though, there might be a lag time that we would expect between the reform, the implementation of the reform, and then finally the improvements in learning outcomes, particularly if you have more disadvantaged children coming into schools at the same time. So one possible explanation for that is that there's been a decline in school readiness, and we can see some evidence that potentially the effect of preschool has washed out. So the preschool advantage that we found in the Young Lives sample is not there in the RISE sample. So perhaps there's been a decline in the quality of preschooling as more children have entered preschool. Now, progress during the 2018-19 year improved substantially, or at least marginally compared to Young Lives, but we don't have the evidence that can really explain what caused the decline in starting test scores at the beginning of grade 4. So that's something which is a bit of a mystery to us. We can explain some of it, but there's a lot more to do on that. The decline may have been worse, of course, without the GQuIP program, and that's really the key evaluation question that we would like to answer. Factors external to the education system in Ethiopia may, of course, have contributed to this, particularly local level conflicts. We'd be glad if you have any comments on this puzzling question. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Kane. We're now going to hand over to Suyun, and I'm told again there might be a small delay in getting the slides up. Okay, they're too pessimistic, all right, AV guys. Straight over to you, Suyun.
Hello, thank you, Claire and RISE team for organizing this. I'm Soyun and I'm from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And then in this project, we're studying whether new learning opportunities can change gender attitudes for girls in Tanzania. Next slide, please. Gender inequality is widespread almost everywhere in the world, but it is severer in developing countries.
Hang on a second, we've just lost your volume. Any idea why, guys?
Hello, can you hear that?
Can you try saying something again, Suyun? Okay, still not working.
It's not working?
Yes, now faintly, but can you say something else?
In the chat, okay. So it might be.
We can get the volume up.
So should I go ahead?
Ideally, it would be a bit louder.
Okay. So gender inequality.
Just wait 5 seconds.
Sure.
Yes, try again.
Could you try speaking again?
Is it better now?
I think we'll proceed. We can just about hear you. Try and speak loudly if you can. Okay.
Okay.
Let's start again. We didn't hear anything you said.
Okay, so yeah, gender inequality is widespread everywhere basically, but it is severer in developing countries. For instance, in Tanzania, where our study was conducted, the enrollment rates in upper secondary education are 50% higher for boys and girls. And also in developing countries, STEM education is generally lacking and the quality tends to be low. Moreover, science is perceived as difficult, especially for girls, and there is a significant gender gap in terms of performances in this subject. Next slide. So in this study, we analyzed the effects of providing 5-day STEM bootcamp, which has emphasis on experiences. So in this bootcamp, students learn how to code actually using computers and then build robots. And our research question in this paper is whether practical STEM learning programs can affect gender attitudes. Next slide. So of course, there is the question on why this STEM education opportunity can affect gender attitudes. And there could be multiple channels. First, it is through new hands-on learning experiences in STEM, especially given that girls tend to be less self-confident. So actually experiencing this new subjects and new programs can boost their self-esteem. And also, given that STEM is generally male dominant, it may boost interest in STEM subjects for girls, and then that may change their gender attitudes. Another possibility is through labor market aspirations. These topics that were learned from the bootcamp may update girls' perception on their future earnings, then that could also affect gender attitudes. Also, there could be other channels such as female role models, because one of the teachers was female, and also there could be some peer effects. But we're going to mainly focus on the first mechanisms. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly mention the related literature. So we contribute to the literature on the formation of gender-related preferences. In the previous studies, it has been shown that direct interventions to change gender attitudes, such as gender equality education or life skills intervention, are effective, but also indirect factors could affect gender attitudes, such as new labor market opportunities or cable TV about gender equality. So there aren't many studies on the impacts of education on gender attitudes. The only exception is this Du et al. Paper, which showed that the Chinese compulsory education reform, and then that induced more egalitarian gender role attitudes, especially for girls. But this study was more of a longer term study after 20 years of the reform, whereas our study is investigating more direct impact of education and shorter term impact. And also we contribute to the literature on robot and tech education. Previous studies mostly focused on the impact on cognitive outcomes. And in this study, we focus on non-cognitive outcomes. Next slide. So this is the outline. I'm going to talk about country background and intervention, and then I'm going to talk about the results. Next slide. So Tanzania is located in East Africa, and then it's one of the least developed countries. And computer access is pretty limited. Each student has 0.04 computers, whereas in the US, 3 three students share one computer. And gender inequality is also not great. And there is a significant gender gap in education and in labor outcomes. Next slide. So our intervention, the boot camp, the 5 days boot camp, was conducted in the Tabora region of Tanzania, and it is one of the lower income areas where its GDP per capita is 9th out of 23 regions. And our boot camp was referred to children who have basic math knowledge, so they were between grade 7 to grade 10. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, the distinctive feature of this program is that unlike the traditional style lecture, it provided more experience, hands-on experiences. So it consisted of sessions to assemble robots and use basic codings to create robots, and also students used coding to create simple apps. And the program was very intensive. So it was from 8:30 to 6 p.m. every day for 5 days. So even though it was within just 5-day period, the dosage was pretty large. Next slide. So this is these are the pictures from the intervention, and then from the interviews later on, students said that they really enjoyed the program and they really liked it. Next slide. So this was our timeline. So we conducted baseline surveys, and then afterwards we conducted the boot camp for 3 weeks. Each was 5 days, so we had 3 groups. And then we conducted the end-line surveys about a month after. We plan to do another round of end-line surveys, but because of COVID, we weren't able to do that. Next slide. So of course, it's important to know what the selection criteria was. So we, our sample students were from these compassion centers. This is one of the large children sponsorship organization. And then 180 students were chosen among about 800 students. And then Compassion Center selected children randomly, conditional on the class year and attendance to the centers. But unfortunately, there were several imbalances between participants and non-participants. So we conditioned on which, fortunately, at least we have reached baseline characteristics and pre-outcomes. So we condition on those variables, and then also we weight the observations with the inverse of propensity score. Next slide. So we see that after then, we don't see any significant difference between the 2 groups, participants and non-participant groups. And can you go next slide, 2 slides, please. Yeah, so we don't see any significant difference. Next slide. So this is our empirical model. So we control for pre-outcomes and also baseline characteristics. It's very rich, including personalities and family background. And then our coefficient of interest is, of course, beta. And as mentioned earlier, we weight this regression with the inverse of propensity scores. Next slide. So let me talk about the results now. So this shows the effect of STEM bootcamp on gender attitude index for all the students, including boys and girls. And then we find that STEM, the participants' gender attitudes increased by about 0.18 standard deviation after the STEM bootcamp. And I think it's worthwhile to mention that this effect size is comparable to the direct intervention on gender Inequality. So this paper, Dar et al. Studied the program on gender equality conducted in India, and then they found the increase of 0.18 standard deviation. So this effect size is really similar to ours. And then the difference is that they did 20 hours of intervention over 2.5 years, and then our intervention was more than twice of 20 hours, but it was conducted in a rather shorter period of time. Next slide. And then we looked at the results by gender, and then we can see that the effects are almost all coming from females. And it is expected to a certain degree because the mechanisms that we were discussing, I talked about earlier, are all more relevant to females. And also, I want to highlight that in the Dar et al. Paper, where the direct intervention was conducted, the effects on gender attitudes were higher for boys. So for boys who have more opportunities in general, it appears to be the case that the direct intervention is more effective. But for girls who usually have less opportunities, this kind of being exposed
you have
to
4 minutes.
Yes.
4 minutes.
Being exposed to new opportunities can be effective. Next slide. So let me skip this next slide. And then we looked at various heterogeneous effects, especially by socioeconomic status and previous exposure to computers. And we do not find that much, but in the third column, we see that students who are from the households with below median number of rooms tend to have higher impact, but the coefficient is very imprecisely estimated, so we cannot have a strong conclusion there. Next slide. And then we tried to explain what mechanisms are at play, and then we investigated self-esteem and interest in STEM subjects, and then the perceived earnings in the labor market. So we first looked at how STEM intervention affected these outcomes, and then we conducted a decomposition analysis to understand what factors explains the gender attitude change the most. Next slide. So we see that for girls, self-esteem increased significantly, and then interest in STEM subjects also improved, and there was an increase in perceived labor earnings. We didn't see a lot for career aspiration. Next slide. So this is the decomposition analysis results, and then among those factors, we found that the perceived increase in labor market earnings is the most important factor that explains our results on gender attitudes for girls. Next slide. And then one question that might come up is whether this gender attitude actually affects the behavior. And then to explore that, we investigated the impact on study hours, and then we also looked at long-term expectations. And then we see that study hours increase not just for math and science, but also for other subjects. So there is a spillover effect. And we don't see a lot on educational goal, probably because the baseline level of education goal was pretty high for this sample from the beginning. And then we see that students wanted to study engineering and technology more. And next slide. And then students were less likely to choose low-skilled jobs as an expected
1 minute left.
occupation.
1 minute.
Okay, so yeah, so can you, next slide, and next slide. So let me conclude. So we studied about the education opportunities, STEM opportunities, and then how that affects gender attitudes. And then we found significant positive impact on gender attitudes for girls, but not for boys. And labor market opportunities appear to be the most important channel to explain that. And then we also observed some behavioral changes. So that's it, and thank you.
Okay, we're going to organize ourselves so that at least 3 of us are going to come down the front. If Noreen wants to get herself in position in the DC hub, I've been asked if we could possibly not wear masks. Are you comfortable with that? It's very hard for people to hear otherwise. Okay, so let's get started with the Q&A. We're going to take 3 questions from the chat, and then we'll open it up to the hubs. We'll go in this order, so get ready, people in the hubs. We'll start with Abuja, then we'll go to DC, and then we'll come to Oxford. And if there's still time remaining, we'll circle back to questions coming in online. Feel free, if you are in one of the hubs, to submit your questions online as well. Okay, so our first questions are for Noreen. I have a question from Barbara Brands. What do we know about how, in capitals, public and private schools raised learning? How did public schools use the marginal funding that they received? And what specific kinds of actions constituted the intensive margin in neighboring private schools? I'll read all of these questions out so that the other speakers have a chance to do some thinking. So Noreen, hopefully you've got that question from Barbara. Then another question for you from Felipe. Are these grants a permanent shock or a transitory shock? Also, was the money expected or unexpected for the schools? And a comment really, the investment of the money is very different depending on whether it's permanent or transitory or expected or unexpected. So perhaps you can comment on that. Then a question for Amanda. To what extent is the team looking at peer effects? This seems like a potential explanation for the low or null effects. So Noreen, hopefully you've had time to think, and the floor's yours.
Thanks, Claire. So Barbara, thanks. So this is an important question. What did schools spend the money on? Public and private schools did invest the money differently. There are some effects on expenditures in terms of infrastructure. So for example, public schools built walls, but that was sort of anyone who didn't have one, which was already 90%, built a wall. There was some, investment in terms of semi-permanent classrooms, things like that. But when we look at the average effect of all of the investments, there's not really anything there. It's just kind of 1 or 2 things. Importantly, is the investments in teachers and how those differed across public and private schools. So in public schools, there were a lot of contract teachers that were hired, and contract teachers are thought to have higher levels of accountability, right? Because they, unlike public servants, can be fired. So this hiring of more teachers enabled smaller class sizes, and that could have helped with improving learning. The public schools also tended to hire teachers that have lower levels of education and training, but that's completely consistent with the characteristics of contract teachers, right? In private schools, what they did is hire marginally more qualified teachers. So these are the differences in what they did. Felipe, thanks to you as well. This was not a permanent increase. If Jashnu can correct me if I'm wrong, the money did eventually stop flowing to schools. It stopped, right? At some point, it's still going. The control schools caught up, yeah. Okay, so so your next part of the question, yes, it was unexpected. People didn't know after round 1 that there was going to be this large influx of cash. There were all kinds of administrative delays, and yeah, people did not know in advance.
Amanda, over to you about peer effects. This was an anonymous question.
Yeah, I mean, it's super hard to tease out, right? Like this literature is kind of big and also very, very murky. I'll say a couple of things. One is that we do see teachers kind of reporting more behavior issues, like doing kind of different strategies in the classroom to kind of deal with behavior issues. But I don't know how much stock to put in that. I think it's definitely possible. There's a peer effect on the top quintile, but for the bottom quintiles, we would hope this would be a positive effect, and we don't see that. So, I'm sorry, it's really hard to answer that question, but certainly something we're thinking about a lot. And I'd love suggestions on kind of how to parse that out better.
Great, thanks. So now let's go to the Abuja Hub and take a question there. Do we have someone with a question for maybe from two of the other panelists, Suyun or Dawit and Kane? Do we have a question? Could someone indicate from the Abuja Hub whether we have a question? Yeah, there are some hands going up. So just, I think, waiting for the microphone to reach them.
All right. From the discussions, I want to ask some questions, and this is there any possibility that private school students' outcome would be higher if their schools get grants and subventions? The other part of my question is this. Some of the studies seem to indicate that low-income families do not necessarily make choices for public schools. Am I correct? And why is that? Thank you.
So I think the first question, Noreen, maybe you would like to comment on, and then I think all of our panelists can probably speak to the second question, but maybe we should let Amanda start with that. So Noreen?
Yes, thanks so much for the question. In fact, someone has already written a paper about that. So there is another paper on grants given to private schools with the same set of co-authors, excluding myself. But the dream team, Jishnu, Tahir, and Asim. What, Yakutis? I don't know about. But yeah, so I encourage you to have a look at that paper. It's called The Equilibrium Effects of Grants to Private Schools. And yeah, that paper, I mean, we sort of didn't do an experiment where we cross-randomized, grants to public schools versus grants to private schools in this design. But yeah, there are indications that yes, private schools would still improve. So, there are changes that private schools can make to improve their quality in response to both public and private school grants.
Amanda, maybe you would like to comment on, and in particular, the difference between your context and Noreen's as to why people were choosing private schools differently in the Indonesian context.
Sure. So was the question that, was it more, I think it was more about low-income families choosing public schools. Was that right? I think the question was why aren't lower income families choosing like the best public schools they can get into? I see, or did you understand it differently?
I think comment on the relative performance of public and private schools in the Indonesian context.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In terms of going to your original question, yes, definitely the contrast between Pakistan is pretty stark here. I think that public schools are overwhelmingly preferred, and pretty much everyone applies to public schools. Like, so even if they can't get in, our entire sample basically applied to public schools. So it's certainly like a choice. Now, I think it's a question. So there in our in the city, there are 16 public schools. Are people choosing the absolute best public school that they can get into? Not always. And obviously, that choice is very complicated, but certainly like the private school market in Indonesia is less competitive and also, relies a lot on these public subsidies. So like lower income students can use vouchers to go to public school and public money funds these private schools.
Do you guys have anything to comment?
Maybe
I would put it on me.
just something brief which Dawit might follow up on is that in our sample, most of the schools are public schools, and actually attendance at private schools in Ethiopia is quite rare. But the biggest decline we saw in test scores is in the rural areas where I think access to a private school is least likely. So I think that's not likely to be a big part of the explanation of our story. But what do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I think, as you know, we focused on the public schools in our study. I mean, we haven't made any comparison with private schools, but I agree with Kane. The private school penetration in Ethiopia is only in urban areas. So yeah, I don't think we could say a lot in terms of the private public school issue in terms of Ethiopia, at least.
Suyun, I don't know if you have anything to add on this. Don't feel compelled. We can't hear you though.
She's still muted.
Can someone unmute Suyun?
So our context is not at the school, so I don't think I can comment a lot on that. But yeah, other panelists have more information there.
Noreen, is that a raised hand? You want to come in?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really important question because it sort of draws the session together nicely, right? Thinking about all the different contexts that have been described in each of these countries. And so, our paper is really talking about a context that is, yes, it's what we observe in Pakistan, but it's one that is getting increasingly prevalent in other countries. So India is another excellent example of this, where there's a lot of choice between public and private schools. And, in our case, private schools do outperform public schools. And so that's sort of where everyone wants to be. But it's really this issue of leveraging that market structure and, providing different kinds of interventions. It's going to be different. I mean, this seems very obvious, but it is going to depend on the market factors of school availability. And so, it's important to think about that. It's important to think about compositional effects on students, types of schools. And, while there's nothing on that in our paper, in contrast to the other papers in this session, another thing that comes out is this is several years after the program, right? So it's really important to look at those equilibrium effects, several years later when the market has settled in. And that was exactly what Dawit and Kane raised, was that, it'd be interesting to see what happens in the Young Lives sample and Rise sample after that.
Okay, great. Whilst DC is on unmuted, can I see if there's a question from the audience in DC? Noreen, at the moment, I can't see them. So can you tell me if there's a question?
Yes, it's Sabrine.
Okay, great.
For Amanda, I know you have some evidence on what's happening at home, where the students are getting tutoring, but do you have, by any chance, a way to know what's happening in the classroom? Because I think maybe others are thinking along the same lines. You take very homogeneous classrooms and you make them very heterogeneous. And so teachers, can find it harder to teach at the level of the students. And that might affect negatively scores of students throughout the distribution, as you see.
Do you want me to answer that straight away, Claire, or you want to collect questions?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is something we're still kind of trying to unpack. What I mentioned before is that we do see some changes in terms of, okay, so just to start again, I think that all the teachers in the sample are pretty much say that they're doing things differently than they did before. And maybe they're doing the wrong things, I don't know, but about if we asked a question on kind of how are you dealing differently with this cohort, and 90% of teachers gave some response. So I think that teachers are certainly, trying to adapt. We have, evidence from the qualitative work that teachers were asking for more support. So they're asking for more training in some schools, meaning like they've reached out to like the local university and said kind of, I need more help trying to figure out how to adapt to this different type of composition in my classrooms. We know that teachers are dealing with more behavior issues, like they're grouping the classes different, like we asked about like seating arrangements, and teachers are kind of seating kids differently to kind of control behavior issues. But I don't we did a lot of, we did some classroom observation, but it didn't really pick up a lot of huge changes kind of on normal things that you like measure in let's say a Stallings instrument or something like that. So we're still trying to figure that out, but certainly like teachers are reacting. The other thing I'll mention, is that there is more like tracking as a result of this policy. So, the schools definitely recognize the difference and they're trying to adapt. It just could be that they weren't prepared and they didn't know how to adapt.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Okay, I'm going to open up to see if anyone in Oxford has a question. Sorry, I don't know your name. Can you shout your name? And yeah.
My name is Ben Durbin. It's a question for, I'm afraid we're keeping you busy. And it was, wanted to draw a connection between your presentation and the one that Andrew Rosser gave yesterday on the political economy of reform in education in Indonesia. I was wondering, just drawing some of the groups he mentioned, whether there was by the elites, whether there was any gaming of the zoning system, whether the sort of second version of it was a response in some way to a response, sort of objections to that system by the elites, and finally whether this policy change was an example of a policy that sort of unified the interests of sort of the technocrats and the progressives, insofar that it's sort of a technocratic reform that nevertheless somehow opens up access to broader social groups to education. Thank you.
Amanda, can someone unmute Amanda?
I'm unmuted. I can do it, I think. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think that I didn't go into kind of like a lot of the background back and forth about the policy just for time reasons, but it got to the point where there was basically a lawsuit between the local government filed a lawsuit with the central government and ultimately lost. So the central government was certainly like, was trying to impose this policy, and the city especially resisted. So just to kind of answer your question about the elites, certainly the second policy reform was a clear response to parental pressure and parents who have, higher testing students. And they said, this is so unfair. We want our access back. But in terms of kind of, this gaming the zoning system, I think the way that you would game it is that you would move to move to be near your preferred school. And we don't see much evidence of mobility, at least as reported by the students. So we asked them like if they moved in the past year, and we don't see students saying that. So I definitely think that this is, to respond to your question about elites, certainly this is due to kind of like the constituency of parents who are pretty powerful in this area, kind of prompted the second policy change. I think it's a big question still for the national government. What are they going to do? Because I don't think that, we have this case in Jogja where you might make things more equitable using residence-based admissions, but that's certainly not the case in a lot of other cities. So I think, I don't know that I'd recommend this policy, but that you didn't ask that question.
Thanks. Okay, I'm now going to collect up another few questions. So 2 questions for Darwin and Kane, and I'm going to ask you to answer them relatively briefly. I will then read out a question for Soo-Yun, and you can think about the answer whilst Kane and Darwin answer. So the first question is from Keith Lewin. If the learning loss over 4 years was equivalent to a loss of 1 year's learning, this is staggering, especially given the level of external investment in GCRIP2, which is at least $500 million. what went wrong with the GQuIT theory of change and what support might work more effectively. And then a second question from Ruth Naylor, another hypothesis for the drop in scores in Ethiopia, might this be a case of teacher training at the wrong level, pushing pedagogical change that's beyond the level of the teachers, resulting in more ineffective classroom practice? So think about the answers to that. And then for Suyun, I'm going to ask a question. Was there a dissenter in the room to that? No? Okay. I'm going to ask a question, knowing Diva Da very well, as she's a D4 student of mine. I was really struck by the difference in the gender effects between their paper, where there was an effect on boys through a direct gender attitude intervention, and your study, which was indirect and experiential, but had no effect on boys. And I wondered if you had any hypothesis around that. So time to think on that, and over to you guys. And Darwit's pointing at Kane, Kane's pointing at Darwit.
Okay, I'll start. I mean, to answer Keith's question, that was obviously the topic of the paper. We don't have a complete answer, but GQuIT was an enormous investment, and it has made a lot of difference in school quality in the measurable outcomes. So it's not that the project has failed, but perhaps the level of investment that would have been required to offset the differences in backgrounds of pupils, when you've now got much closer to 100% enrollment, you've got the most disadvantaged children coming into schools, which you did not have before. And it was a 6-year period, not a 4-year period. So it's a bit longer than 4 years only, but it's a time during which there was a lot of change in the composition of schools. I just suspect that the investment was not enough. I don't think that necessarily I would have said it failed.
Just to add one point to what Kane said, probably we should have mentioned earlier in our presentation, one of the limitation I would say about our studies, we don't have data on the implementation fidelity of the program. So we don't know which of the activities or which of the components were implemented in which school. So it's possible that some of the schools couldn't get the interventions as designed. So, you know, just to add on what Kane mentioned.
And some of the schools did say they didn't receive the grants, for example. So that would be evidence of poor implementation of some elements of the program. But there was a big change in the teachers. Teachers became younger, less experienced, but more likely to have good content knowledge. So I think for Ruth, it's a complex answer to that. In some ways, teacher quality improved. In others, it probably didn't. But we don't have evidence, particularly on pedagogical change, for example, at any specific level, only training and content knowledge.
Yeah, we only have that information on teachers' content knowledge. And yeah, I mean, as you said, we also, of course, we didn't present it, but we also have tried to make some association between the content knowledge of teachers and learning progress made within a school year for students. So we actually found out that some teachers who benefited from the in-service training by the GQuIP2 program appear to have made some impact on students' learning outcomes or on students' learning progress within the school year.
Great. Suyun.
So thank you for the question, Claire. So for the other paper about the direct intervention, there was impact for both boys and girls, but then after 2 years, the effects were higher for boys. On the other hand, yeah, it's in our setting, we didn't find any impact on boys. And then the reason behind that, we think that the mechanism, so there are this self-confidence and interest in STEM subjects and also perceived labor market earnings. So it is possible that they affect girls' outcomes because, for example, for the labor earnings, so there are gender norms such as women shouldn't earn more than husbands, or women should stay home. And then these new learning opportunities might change this, but for boys, it's less so. And in terms of self-confidence as well, boys I mean, at the baseline, boys have higher self-confidence, and then there is we don't think there is a clear link on why this increase in confidence in boys can affect gender attitude. Whereas for girls, they actually feel like we can actually participate in the labor market, and then socially we can have more voices. So that could, that is one of the reasons. And then there could be other ways that affect boys' gender attitudes. We think, for example, they interact with girls who are working on the same thing as boys, so they might change their attitudes on girls' social participation and things like that. So we wanted to test that. Our experiment wasn't designed to test that, but we had variations in sex ratios for 9 different groups boot camp, and then we didn't find so much of such gender compositional effects. And then unfortunately, we didn't, our study was also not designed to test the female role models, but in some groups, people were exposed to female teachers, and then we also didn't see a lot on boys' gender attitude. So that is the reason we're thinking.
Thank you. I think if you don't know Diva already, I should connect the two of you. Okay, great. So in the negative amount of time that we have left, I'm just going to leave you with 3 takeaways. Well, this is what I took, and maybe it'll be helpful to you. So I was really struck by the importance of thinking about market level analysis that came out across the papers, in particular thinking through how spillovers can impact on schools and pupils via the choice mechanism, and that the quality of the different market alternatives, how that has an impact on outcomes and likely welfare. I was struck by the importance of thinking about compositional effects. It came through very strongly in Amanda's paper and in your paper, and thinking about which groups are attending which schools, not only by socioeconomic status, but also by gender. And then from Suyun's paper, I was really struck by the fact that maybe going back to basics and thinking about learning opportunities and experiences is a good way to try and affect gender outcomes rather than trying to tackle the attitudes themselves. So those were my 3 takeaways. Thanks to everybody for attending the session. Thanks to all of our speakers. And one final round of applause, and then we'll see you at 4:15.
Okay, so for the second break,